opening words this morning were composed for this very date and first recited on April the 19th by the author of these verses, the Concord Hymn. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, here the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. I invite you now to take a candle or a chalice if you have one, and to join me in reading together as we light our flame. We light our flaming chalice to illuminate the world we seek. In the search for truth, may we be just. In the search for justice, may we be loving. And in loving, may we find peace. The reading this morning is from Thomas Paine, who during the American Revolution wrote a series of pamphlets collectively titled The Crisis. This edition is from December of 1776. 'Tis surprising to see how rapidly a panic will sometimes run through a country. All nations and all ages have been subject to them. Yet panics, in some cases, have their uses. They produce as much good as hurt. Their duration is always short. The mind soon grows through them and acquires a firmer habit than before. But their peculiar advantage is that they are touchstones of sincerity and hypocrisy, and bring thing and men to light which might otherwise have lain forever undiscovered. These are the times that try men's souls. Our country has been through very hard times before, through a violent revolution, through a bloody civil war, breadlines in the 30s, and the fight of our parents that produced what we now call the greatest generation. And times of panic do reveal character. Like our forebears in times of crisis, may we rise to this present occasion with sobriety and realism, with patience and perseverance and courage for the long haul. Naturally, somewhat anxious and fearful, but not allowing ourselves to be conquered by fear, in the knowledge that our individual destinies are bound together in mutual cooperation and concern for the common good, knowing that these times that try our souls can be both terrible and wonderful times to be alive. In silent meditation, we now remember and reach out with our hearts to all those who are sick, to those who have died around the world from this novel coronavirus, 159,371 across the globe, almost 40,000 here in our own country. We reach out with sympathy to their families, especially to communities of color here at home and to the native people of New Mexico who have been so hard hit. And we send our gratitude to the researchers and technicians who are searching for a vaccine, and to all the defenders on the front lines, from delivery drivers to EMTs. On this day, April the 19th, in 1775, the American Revolution began. The night before, 800 British regulars garrisoned in Boston began to march on the town of Concord, Massachusetts. A few months earlier, the provincial assembly, the colonists elected council that had been disbanded by the British governor, that provincial congress gathered in the meeting house of the first parish of the village there, and they formed committees of Minutemen to begin preparing for the common defense. They made the decision to store munitions in Concord, which was far enough away from Boston for secrecy, but also close enough for convenience. And it was to seize this storehouse of weapons that the English general had set his troops into motion. These redcoats would have been surprised to learn that William Dawes and Paul Revere were riding ahead of them to alert the local militias. In the town of Lexington, Revere stopped at the house where John Adams and John Hancock were sleeping that night and sent the two patriots scurrying through the woods to safety. By 2 a.m. that morning, about 130 men had gathered on the Lexington Green under the command of Captain John Parker, a 45-year-old veteran of the French and Indian War. How the fighting erupted is unclear. Later, each side would claim the other had fired the first shot. But however it started, the Americans were sorely outgunned and outnumbered. When the British gave their victory salute half an hour later and resumed their march, 8 Americans were dead, most of them shot in the back. The first to sound the alarm in nearby Concord was the minister, William Emerson, who began to ring the church bells, and he was soon joined by neighbors from outlying farms. When the British entered the town, the Americans withdrew to a hill overlooking the old North Bridge. The redcoats started to ransack the town in search of guns. When they set a liberty pole aflame and a plume of smoke started to rise over the rooftops, the Minutemen lost their patience, seeing that their own homes might be burned. And then, as the Americans advanced, the British soldiers crowded at the end of the bridge, first firing warning shots and then a volley directly into the colonists' ranks. The Minutemen returned fire, and the British, the best trained army in the world, broke and ran. A few days later, William Emerson wrote in his journal, "This month remarkable for the greatest events taking place in the present age." The men who were there were not just the founders of our country, but also the forebearers of our faith. John Adams and John Hancock both were early Unitarians. A bell forged by Paul Revere hung in the steeple of the Unitarian congregation I served in Burlington, Vermont for many years. Of course, it was the Unitarian poet of a later generation, Longfellow, who would make Revere's Midnight Ride a standard of recitation for school children everywhere. Theodore Parker, the great 19th century abolitionist minister who helped to fund John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, was the grandson of Captain John Parker of the Lexington Regiment. The first parish in Concord, where the Provincial Congress and then the Continental Congress convened, was then and remains a Unitarian church today. And William Emerson, who shouted to his countrymen, "If we die, Let Us Die Here, was the grandfather of Ralph Waldo, whose Concord hymn we heard as the opening words for this morning's service, a poem commissioned for the 50th anniversary of the historic battle, inscribed now on a votive stone that you pass as you walk onto the wooden bridge where it all started. It did start there, but thankfully it did not end there. Concord was just a skirmish. It was an opening salvo. There were so many other titanic battles to follow, not just for independence, but to abolish slavery, to secure the rights of women, to end child labor, to vanquish Jim Crow, and martyrs died in all of these struggles. Activists are still risking their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor to finish the revolution that started on April 19th and to bring us one step closer to that beloved community of justice and equality and freedom. Which brings us to the present. For, as Thomas Paine observed, panics in some cases have their uses. They produce as much good as hurt. Their duration is always short. The mind grows firmer through them and acquires a better habit than before. And perhaps our own minds will be enlarged from this fight against a common enemy. Perhaps the disruption in our daily routines will help us to rethink our priorities of what things truly matter, of which people deserve our time and attention and respect. And perhaps as our bodies learn to heal and fend off this virus, our body politic may also find some healing. For one of the few things that actually changes people, I've found, is grief. For good or ill, for better and sometimes for worse, suffering does change people. In cultures around the world, mythologist Joseph Campbell observed, it's the undergoing of an ordeal that produces a change in identity, the passage from one state of being into the next. And the ordeal involves receiving some kind of wound, like Jacob wrestling with the angel. So, for example, birth is an ordeal for both the mother and the child. Coming of age, the passage from childhood to maturity, is an ordeal for the girl. The beginning of menstruation. For the boy, circumcision or other male rites of initiation. And what holds true for the individual also applies to society. In collective terms, our revolution was an ordeal that forged a new identity for our nation. We were no longer subjects of a king, but citizens of a republic. The Civil War was an ordeal. 600,000 dead, not just to cleanse the stain of slavery, but also to forge a new kind of consciousness, where people no longer thought of themselves primarily as Virginians or New Yorkers, but as Americans belonging to these United States. Selma, I think, was another ordeal that seared the conscience of North and South alike, and that at great sacrifice changed our country for the better. And only time will tell, but it's possible that COVID-19 may be another ordeal, because before the end of this pandemic, many will have grieved loved ones, lost to a microbe that makes no partisan distinctions, that infects red and blue states alike, conservatives as well as liberals. Many will have come to understand that we're all vulnerable, all mortal, all interdependent on the social fabric of postal workers and grocery clerks and school teachers, as well as scientists and doctors and first responders who are in the trenches of this epidemic. And out of that shared suffering may come a new sense of compassion. Maybe the lockdown will make a difference in Concord, too. If you had visited that town 2 months ago, you would have found an upscale suburb full of smart restaurants and chic boutiques, its citizens busy getting and spending, more concerned with their smartphones than with their neighbors, so that the author of Walden, who once lived there, might be more moved than ever to say that our inventions are wont to be pretty toys that distract our attention from more serious things. The so-called old manse, the parsonage, where Concord's minister once stood at his desk to write his 2-hour sermons, knowing his homily wasn't long enough until his feet started to hurt, is a museum now. It's temporarily closed due to the coronavirus. But it has a gift shop attached where until recently for $2 you might have bought a copy of the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. What you could not buy, of course, was the spirit behind them. The goal of true freedom, a democracy where every person has a sense of dignity and worth, a commonwealth of independent thinkers and readers, a nation that cares more for its principles than for its pocketbook, an enlightened citizenry concerned for the general welfare, working in concert to form a more perfect union. These things all seem in some ways farther away than ever. Defeating the British, it turned out, was easy compared to the task of governing ourselves wisely and well. But it was the Unitarians of Concord who showed us where every revolution has to begin from inside ourselves. And now I'd ask Bob Obrecht to request your support for this community of faith.
Gary, thank you. While we're not meeting in person, our regular congregation expenses continue with a few changes. We're not paying rent. We are continuing to pay Gary and Monroe for services, but not mileage from Santa Fe. We will not receive, of course, any plate donations. So I ask you to, I have a real basket, and I'd ask you to pass the virtual basket. Please be generous in your pledge payments. You can mail payments to Betty Meyerson.
Who said, "My country is the world. All people are my sisters and my brothers, and my religion is to do good." I want to thank you all for being here, for listening.